Okay, this is my extra credit presentation on the research paper Self-Blinding Citizen Science to Explore Psychedelic Microdosing. So, just to start off, I'm going to go over an introduction that includes some vocab and just to kind of introduce you to microdosing and what that means. I'll go over how the study is set up, how the data is collected, some key details, the results and conclusions, and some future work, future research in the next steps. So first off, self-blinding means participants were given instructions online on how to incorporate a placebo control into their microdosing routine without clinical supervision. So the way that the researchers achieved this was by preparing identical looking capsules and utilizing QR codes so only the experimenters could know which capsules were being taken, and the participants could stay blind. What is microdosing? Microdosing is a practice of routinely using low doses of psychedelic drugs. Low doses are defined as about 10 to 20% of a recreational dose. These doses are taken between 1 to 3 times a week to be considered microdosing. So the whole appeal of microdosing is that reportedly people microdose to enhance creativity, energy, emotional balance, and problem-solving ability. Others use it more to relieve symptoms of anxiety, depression, and even addiction. And an important key discrepancy is that microdosing does not produce hallucinations. It has gained some popularity recently, but it does not have any statistical evidence yet to prove that consuming sub-threshold doses of psychedelics have a result that is greater than the placebo effect. So people choosing to microdose and then basing their chosen treatment are off of these anecdotal reports, which are personal experience and observation. So there's there's just no standardized study that has really been done to prove that microdosing has these beneficial effects greater than a placebo. So this study is meant to address this gap in research and test if microdosing actually does have benefits like people claim. I'll spoil it for you. This study concluded that any statistically significant differences between microdosing and the placebo group can be explained by participants actually breaking blind. So when they find out what group they're in. So essentially, that all boils down to uh, people report feeling the way they do when they're microdosing solely because of a placebo effect, which is really interesting. Um, the last vocab is the citizen science approach. So this particular study utilized a citizen science approach, which means the participants were recruited and participated globally through online instructions. So using this method, the study was able to eliminate the bias of uncontrolled studies that have been previously done, as well as the downsides of a controlled study, which is a small sample size. And another upside to this citizen science approach is that this study has greater ecological validity than a controlled lab study. All right, so the experiment setup. Um, it was 10 weeks long, so there was first a baseline week to collect data without any effect of a microdose or a placebo, and then 4 weeks of treatment. So people were split up between three groups. They were either microdosing psychedelics, a placebo, so nothing, or they had 2 weeks of doing a placebo and 2 weeks of microdosing an actual psychedelic. And then the third step, the last week, was a follow-up after about a month after the treatment was done. So in the treatment, the doses were taken twice a week. And the data was collected three different ways. So there was an accumulative way, post-acute, and acute. The accumulative way was meant to capture the monthly effects of microdosing. And so it was assessed monthly, once at the very beginning of the baseline, once after the 4 week dosing period, and once at the final week. So what they used to collect data in the accumulative section is risk psychological well-being, cognitive and affective mindfulness scale, satisfaction with life scale, green paranoid thought scales, big five personality traits, and then they added another personality trait, which was intellect. And then lastly, cognitive performance, which was quantified by spatial span, paired associates, rotations, odd one out, spatial planning, and feature match. All of these scores were taken from previously published works. The second way to collect data was the post-acute way. So this was an aim to capture the weekly effects. So they did these collections on Sundays when there was no dose taken. So around 48 to 70 hours of no drug or no placebo, nothing in the system. And they used the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptomology, Spellberger State Trait Anxiety Inventory, and the Social Connectiveness Scale. And then lastly, they had acute, which aimed to capture the daily effects of microdosing. So this acute section was collected on Thursdays, about 2 to 6 hours after taking a dose. So theoretically, if someone was actually taking a microdose of a psychedelic, that psychedelic would be active. So they used a positive and negative effect schedule, visual analog scale items, and then the same cognitive performance scale as used in the cumulative data collection. All right, so some experiment details. This is just like a couple of questions that I had when I was reading the paper that I thought would be helpful for other people to understand. Um, the drugs were actually sent in by the participants. So they were choosing their own dosage and what drug they wanted to take. So this is what helped the study have a high ecological validity. It ended up being about 61% used LSD, 24% used mushrooms containing psilocybin, and then three other drugs were also used. And also, it's important to note that the people in the study all had psychedelic experience before. So either microdosing or macrodosing, which is when you take the psychedelic up to threshold. So that's kind of important to note that everyone had experience in this study. So here are the results from the accumulative sections. There was a graph that was given in the paper. So as you can see, all groups follow a similar trend, where scores increased. But error bars actually negate any difference that could be statistically significant, which is so interesting. In the acute measurements, there is a significant difference between the placebo and the microdosing group in the emotional state, drug intensity, mood, energy, and creativity. And these states scored higher on days with a microdose in comparison to days without, or that's what that means. And then post-acute measurements only had one significant condition, which was anxiety. So anxiety was reduced at the end of microdosing for a week in comparison to placebo weeks. However, here's the crazy part. The researchers had the participants guess which pill they were taking that week after they had collected the data. They guessed if they had the placebo or the drug, and after adjusting the data to reflect on the guess instead of actually what they were doing. So if someone was, on placebo, but they thought they were microdosing psychedelic or vice versa, there was actually no condition across acute or post-acute data that was statistically significant besides drug intensity, which is just mind-blowing. So it's just mental. And the conclusions here uh, are these findings suggest that the scores are significantly better when the participant believed they had taken a microdose, regardless of what they actually took. That was the main conclusion here. And second conclusion, placebos were guessed correctly at a higher rate than microdoses. And one that goes along with that is if people were on a higher dosage, they were more likely to be able to guess if they were on their psychedelic or if they were on a placebo. So the main key takeaway here is although there was an improvement in categories in the study, there was no significant difference between the microdose and the placebo group, which suggests that the observed benefits are not caused by the psychedelics of the microdose, but actually by psychological expectations of what people think they should be feeling when they're microdosing. So this means that the improvements documented by personal experience are actually just a result of a belief, the core of a placebo effect. That was the core of the study. Some limitations and some future steps. There was no supervision in this study, so there was no way to ensure that the capsules are being taken in the right timing, the right order, if the data was being collected correctly in the right timing. So that was a major example. They were really trusting the participants there. Um, also, participants mailed in their own doses of psychedelics to be split up into capsules for this treatment step plan. So the dosages that were recorded are not verified because they're off the black market. So this is really representative of real life microdosing. However, it reflects super well in a study because the dosages are not validated. So there's definitely more research that needs to be conducted. The microdose group improved better in all scales when compared to the placebo group, but not to a statistically significant amount. So more research is needed to further understand the effects of psychological expectations of drugs. Um, uh, More to replicate this kind of study, also to study other kinds of drugs like cannabis, would be really important to further this research. And that was this paper. Thank you.